They arrived in America with heads bowed, their uniforms ragged, their pride fractured. Captured in North Africa and Europe, thousands of German prisoners of war were scattered across the heartland of the United States. The trains that carried them rumbled past endless fields of wheat, corn, and cotton. To men who had left behind cities in ruins, the sight of abundance was staggering. But what none of them expected was how quickly those fields would become more than scenery. They would become the setting for a secret chapter of their captivity. Friendships too fragile, too forbidden, to ever be spoken aloud. When the prisoners first stepped onto American soil, they braced for cruelty. They expected cages, chains, humiliation. Instead, they were marched into camps that looked more like military bases than prisons. Wooden barracks, mess halls, soccer fields, even libraries greeted them. Guards barked orders but explained rules in fluent German, invoking the Geneva Convention with a firmness that shocked men accustomed to brutality. The wire fences were real, but they were not cages. And beyond those fences stretched farms that seemed untouched by war. It wasn't long before the farmers came. America's sons had gone overseas to fight, and the harvest still needed hands. Agreements were struck. German prisoners would work in fields and barns, paid a small stipend, fed, and watched by guards who often lounged in the shade while the men labored. To the prisoners it was humiliation at first, soldiers reduced to farmhands. But soon they discovered something that unsettled them more than chains ever could: kindness. Farmers did not look at them with hatred. They looked at them with weary eyes, with practical calculation, with something close to curiosity. These were enemies, yes, but also men with strong arms, men who knew work, men who could help. At first the exchanges were formal, stiff, words translated through guards or gestures. But gradually small cracks opened, a nod of thanks when a fence was repaired, a brief smile when a row of corn was cleared. A jar of water passed not with disdain, but with quiet respect. One prisoner later wrote in his diary, "We feared chains. Instead they gave us tools. We feared beatings. Instead they gave us bread. The farmers looked at us not as monsters, but as workers. That was the beginning of the betrayal of everything we had been told." The secrecy of these friendships began in silence. Guards were not blind. They saw the farmers' gestures, the prisoners' softened expressions. But they rarely interfered. Discipline was enforced, yes, but the war was far away, and the fields demanded labor. In that labor, bonds were born. A farmer might slip an apple into a prisoner's hand. A prisoner might repair a barn door more carefully than required, earning a grateful glance. These gestures seemed small, but in the eyes of men who had been stripped of dignity, they meant everything. One American farmer, interviewed decades later, admitted, "I looked at them and saw boys not much different from my own. They were supposed to be the enemy, but in the field they were just young men doing work. We could not help but respect them." The prisoners felt the same. They had been taught Americans were decadent, weak, soulless. Yet here they saw families who rose with the sun, children who labored alongside their parents, women who managed farms with iron resolve while husbands and sons were at war. The propaganda collapsed before their eyes, and in its place grew something fragile and dangerous: respect. But respect was not all. For some, friendship followed, and friendship in captivity was forbidden. It began with conversations in broken English and broken German. A farmer asking about ploughing methods in Europe. A prisoner asking about the yield of corn. They discovered similarities that astonished them. Both knew the weight of soil, the rhythm of seasons, the pain of drought. Both knew the ache of backs bent beneath work. Beneath uniforms and fences, they were men of the land. One prisoner later confessed, "We spoke of farms, and for a moment the war vanished. He was not my enemy. He was a farmer, as my father was. I felt ashamed for calling him enemy." The secrecy was absolute. They could not tell guards. They could not write home. To admit they had befriended the enemy would bring punishment at best, accusation of treachery at worst. Letters home were censored, every line examined. They wrote only sterile truths. We are healthy, we work daily. But the truth, the forbidden truth, lived only in whispered words in barns, in smiles exchanged across fields, in gestures that no censor could erase. One man wrote secretly, "I wanted to tell my mother that an American farmer shook my hand today. I wanted to tell her that his grip was warm, that he looked at me as a man, not as a prisoner. But I could not. To write it would be to betray both him and myself. So I keep it here, in silence." The friendships deepened with each season. Prisoners carved toys for farmers' children, who pressed marbles or candy into their hands in return. Farmers sometimes smuggled food, jars of jam, fresh milk, eggs, into the camp under the guise of payment. One prisoner remembered receiving a basket of fruit and nearly weeping. "I thought of my family in Germany, starving. I ate with guilt, but also with gratitude. That basket was more than food, it was mercy." The Americans, too, remembered. One farmer's daughter later recalled, "They were so young. I remember one fixed our fence, and when he finished, he smiled at me. He was supposed to be the enemy, but all I saw was a boy far from home." The secrecy of these friendships was their strength and their torment. They could not be celebrated, could not be spoken of. They lived only in the hearts of those who carried the forbidden bonds forged in the soil of a foreign land. As winter approached, the prisoners noticed something even stranger. They looked forward to the work. Not because it freed them from fences, but because it allowed them to see the farmers again, to exchange a nod, a word, a smile. In those brief moments, they felt human again. One diary entry read, "The camp is grey, the barracks are cold. But in the fields, when the farmer hands me water, I feel warmth. That warmth is more dangerous than chains, for it makes me forget I am a prisoner." For the farmers, the danger was different. Their neighbours whispered warnings. "Be careful, they are enemies." Some townsfolk looked at the friendships with suspicion, even outrage. Yet the farmers could not deny what they saw. These were not monsters. They were men who worked hard, who laughed quietly when children played, who showed respect when treated with respect. The farmers understood what outsiders could not, that war had made enemies of men who might otherwise have been neighbours. The secrecy tightened. Both sides knew these bonds could never be spoken of openly, and yet the more forbidden they were, the stronger they became. One farmer admitted years later, "I never told anyone, not my wife, not my children, not my neighbours, but I shook the hand of a German prisoner and I never forgot it. In that moment, he was not my enemy. He was simply a man like me." For the prisoners, the secrecy was both a burden and a salvation. They could not share it, yet it sustained them. It gave them hope, dignity, and the unbearable knowledge that humanity could be found even in the heart of the enemy's land. One man wrote, "The war took everything, but in a barn in America I found a friend. I cannot tell anyone, I cannot even write his name, but I will carry him with me until I die." The friendships that grew between German prisoners and American farmers were like sparks in dry grass, small, hidden, yet impossible to extinguish. What made them powerful was not their boldness, but their secrecy. In the heart of America, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded watchtowers, such bonds were never meant to exist. And yet, in the silence of barns, in the rows of crops, in the shared sweat of labour, they flourished. At first, the farmers treated the prisoners with distance. Orders were given briskly, tools handed over without words. The guards lingered nearby, rifles slung loosely, half watchful and half bored. But as the days stretched into weeks and weeks into months, habits changed. Farmers noticed the precision with which the prisoners repaired a fence, the care with which they stacked hay, the diligence they brought to the harvest. Some of these men had been farmers themselves in Germany, their hands already calloused from soil and plough. They worked not as enemies, but as men of the land, and the American farmers recognized themselves in those gestures. One farmer later remembered, "I saw him mend a wagon wheel, his hands steady as any blacksmith. He reminded me of my own brother. That's when it struck me. They were not so different after all." The recognition cut both ways. The German prisoners, who had been taught Americans were soft and decadent, watched women run farms with iron resolve, watched children labor with strength and confidence. They realized quickly that these people were not weak. They were resilient, practical, and unshakable. Respect grew in silence, each side humbled by the sight of the other. Friendship came in moments so small they could almost be missed. A jar of cool water offered on a sweltering day. A word of thanks spoken in halting German or broken English. A smile shared when a task was finished well. None of these moments could be written in letters home, for every word was censored. None could be spoken openly in the camps, for guards enforced rules with severity. Yet in barns and fields, beyond the reach of constant eyes, such moments became lifelines. One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, "Today the farmer gave me an apple. It was nothing, yet it was everything. For the first time in months I felt like a man, not a number." Another farmer's daughter, interviewed decades later, recalled, "They carved toys from wood scraps for us children. I still have a little horse one of them made. At the time I didn't understand the risk, but now I know it was their way of saying we were all human." The secrecy grew heavier as the friendships deepened. Prisoners knew they could be punished, transferred, or thrown into solitary confinement if discovered. Farmers knew neighbors might brand them unpatriotic, even traitorous, if they showed too much kindness. And yet both sides continued. Some farmers smuggled small baskets of food into the camp, jars of jam, fresh milk, fruit. Others pressed cigarettes or gloves into the prisoners' hands with a quick nod, pretending it was nothing more than fair exchange for labor. One farmer later confessed, "I slipped them bread sometimes. My wife scolded me for it, but I couldn't help it. They worked hard and they were just boys. I couldn't treat them as less than human." The prisoners returned the kindness in ways they could. They carved wooden figurines, whittled tools, mended furniture more carefully than required. Some risked punishment by hiding small sketches in the barns, portraits of the farmers, drawings of children playing, images of a life they knew they would never see again. One farmer discovered such a sketch tucked into the corner of a stall, his daughter feeding chickens, drawn with remarkable care. He kept it until the day he died. The secrecy of these exchanges weighed heavily on the prisoners. They longed to tell their families back home that they had been treated with kindness, that they had found something resembling friendship in the unlikeliest of places. But censorship silenced them. Their letters were stripped of humanity, reduced to sterile assurances, "I am healthy, I am working." One prisoner admitted in his hidden journal, "I wanted to write, 'The farmer shook my hand today. He smiled as though we were neighbors. But if I wrote that, the letter would never reach my mother. So I wrote nothing. I keep the truth in my heart.'" For some, these friendships carried a dangerous temptation. Hope. Hope that the censorship, war might end, that they might return home with more than scars, that the world might one day remember them not as enemies, but as men who had once been treated kindly. This hope sustained them, but it also tormented them, for it was a hope they could never speak aloud. One diary entry read, "The war demands we see them as monsters. Yet when the farmer thanks me, when his children smile, I cannot. I feel I am betraying my country by feeling this, but I cannot stop." The guards were not blind to the bonds forming. Some looked the other way, shrugging at gestures they deemed harmless. Others reported excessive familiarity in their logs, prompting warnings and stricter supervision. But discipline could not erase what had already grown. If anything, the secrecy made the friendships stronger. Every glance, every gift, every handshake carried the weight of risk, and that risk made the bonds unforgettable. By winter, the friendships had become something more profound than even the prisoners expected. They no longer looked at the farmers with suspicion, but with genuine respect. Some even admitted in whispers among themselves that they admired their captors more than they had admired their own commanders. It was a dangerous thought, but it was also the truth. One man whispered in the barracks one night, "If I must die, I would rather die as a farmer than as a soldier. The farmers treat us with more dignity than our generals ever did." His words hung in the air, met with silence. No one dared agree aloud, but in their hearts many did. For the farmers too, the bonds left their mark. Some confessed that they had come to like the prisoners, to see them as more than enemies. One admitted privately, "I knew their names, their faces. When the war ended, I didn't want them to leave. It felt wrong, like losing neighbors." Yet these confessions could never be spoken openly. For every gesture of friendship, there was an equal measure of secrecy. The farmers could not tell their neighbors. The prisoners could not tell their families. The friendships lived only in barns and fields, in carved toys and hidden sketches, in silent handshakes and jars of bread passed in shadows. And perhaps that was why they endured. Because they were forbidden, they were unforgettable. By the spring of 1946, orders arrived. The war was long over, and it was time for the prisoners to be sent back across the Atlantic. For months, rumors had whispered through the camps. Ships were coming, lists were being drawn, the fences would open. But as the reality sank in, the prisoners felt emotions more complicated than joy. They longed for home, yes, for families, for ruined cities they still called theirs. But they also felt the ache of leaving behind something they could never fully explain. The quiet friendships forged in barns and fields, in secrecy and silence, with American farmers who had treated them not as monsters, but as men. The final days in the camps were restless. Prisoners packed their few belongings, blankets, carvings, scraps of drawings, diaries scribbled in stolen moments. They cleaned their bunks, folded their uniforms, prepared for the departure they had once dreamed of, but now dreaded. Beyond the wire, farmers came one last time, bringing baskets of food, as they had so many times before. Eggs, bread, fruit, even jars of jam appeared at the gates. Officially, they were payment for labor. Unofficially, they were farewell. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "The farmer's wife gave me a loaf of bread today. She said nothing, only placed it in my hands. I could not speak either. I bowed my head. It was the first time in my life I felt that bread carried love." For the farmers, too, the end was bittersweet. They had come to rely on the prisoners, not only for their labor, but for the quiet companionship that had grown in the fields. Many admitted, in years to come, that they felt the loss sharply. One farmer confessed, "When the trucks came to take them, it felt like watching neighbors move away. They had been enemies once, but by the end, they were something else." The departures were not grand. No speeches, no ceremonies, just trucks lined up, guards calling names, men filing out in silence. Yet in those moments, gestures spoke louder than words. Farmers pressed photographs into prisoners' hands, pictures of barns, of children, of fields where they had worked together. Prisoners passed back carved toys, sketches, hand-stitched scraps of cloth. No one said the word friendship. No one dared. But that was what it was. One farmer's daughter remembered it vividly, even into old age. "He fixed our fence one last time before he left. Then he handed me a little wooden bird he had carved. He didn't speak, just smiled. I never saw him again. But I kept that bird my whole life." The prisoners boarded trucks, then trains, then ships. As the camps emptied, guards and farmers watched silently. Some raised hands in quick farewells. Some turned away to hide tears. The men being carried eastward looked out the windows, watching the fields pass by, their hearts heavy. For many, America had been a land of captivity, but it had also been the land where they discovered something that war had never taught them: humanity in the enemy. On the voyage home, the prisoners spoke in hushed tones. They did not talk of battles or generals. They spoke of farmers, of barns that smelled of hay, of apples given in secret, of children who laughed without fear, of handshakes exchanged when no one was watching. One man said quietly, "I will tell my children of this one day, not of the war, but of the farmer who treated me as a man." Others shook their heads. "We cannot tell," they answered. "No one would understand. They would call us traitors." And so silence settled over the decks, each man carrying his memories in secret. When they stepped back onto German soil, the contrast was devastating. Cities lay in ruins, streets filled with rubble, families hollowed by hunger. The children of Germany were thin, their eyes sunken, their voices weak. For the men who had just left the abundance of American farms, the comparison was unbearable. One prisoner admitted years later, "The shame was worse than captivity. I had seen American children strong and tall. Then I came home and saw our children starving. That was when I understood defeat fully." They could not tell their families what they had seen. They could not describe the friendships, the kindness, the gifts. To do so would invite accusations of disloyalty, of weakness, of betrayal. So they told half-truths. "We worked hard, the guards were strict, we returned alive." But in hidden diaries, in whispers decades later, the truth surfaced. One diary discovered in an attic read, "The farmer shook my hand the day I left. His grip was strong, his eyes kind. I could not write this in my letters, but I write it here, so that one day someone will know I was not treated as a beast, but as a man." For the farmers, too, the memories lingered. In interviews decades later, they spoke with surprising tenderness of the young men who had once worn enemy uniforms. One said, "I never told anyone at the time, but I liked them. They were respectful, hard-working. They reminded me of my own sons. When they left, I missed them." Another added, "War told us we were enemies, but the soil told us otherwise. In the fields, we were simply farmers together." These confessions remained rare, hidden beneath layers of shame and secrecy. But the objects told their own stories. Wooden toys kept in drawers, sketches folded into family Bibles, photographs of barns preserved alongside carvings made by hands that once held rifles. These tokens survived long after words failed, silent witnesses to friendships that could never be spoken aloud. Historians often overlook these stories. They focus on battles, treaties, and leaders. Yet for the men who lived them, the friendships forged in captivity mattered as much as any battle. They revealed a truth that propaganda could never erase, that even in war, humanity persists, that even behind barbed wire, friendship can bloom. One veteran, interviewed in his final years, put it simply, "The war taught me to hate. The farmer taught me to hope." Another, when asked what memory haunted him most, answered, "Not the fighting, not the hunger. It was the day I left the farm. He handed me an apple. I bowed. That was the